See that just through this one example of walking to school in the UK, there's been a steady decline over the years from the 1970s through to the late 1990s of walking to school, and that has not been replaced by cycling. It's been replaced by motorised transport, which is a key sedentary behaviour. So what can I conclude about prevalence data on screen time? There's really no what I would call definitive national data on screen time. TV is definitely the most prevalent behaviour of any sedentary behaviour, and obviously of screen time behaviour. And actually, TV viewing is largely uncorrelated with moderate to vigorous physical activity. This is a very consistent finding. So when people say that TV stops people being physically active, it actually may not be true. It may stop some being physically active, but the data across many countries, including at least one that's presented at this conference tomorrow, I think, shows that the amount of time children spend watching TV and the amount of time they spend being moderately active is close to zero. Young people spend about 2 to 3 hours a day watching TV, much higher at weekends. And you could say that these figures, 20 to 35%, have excessive levels, which is about 4 hours a day. Now maybe it's that group that you need to look at, and maybe that group will be less physically active. But when you average it out across the population, the picture is less clear. And computer use will include homework, which is purposeful sedentary behaviour, and computer games is primarily a boys' thing. I'd like to pose this question, though, before I move to the second part, and that is, how rapidly are things changing? We could collect data now, and in 5 years' time it will be quite different. Particularly things like more active computer games, different types of technology, different types of sedentary behaviour will evolve. Now, whether that means we spend more time being sedentary is to be decided. Because we were sedentary in previous generations, we're probably more sedentary now, and also in different ways. So we need to unravel that interaction. So I spent most of my time on prevalence, just to give you an idea of the data. I just want to make shorter comments about the second two questions. When does screen time take place, and does it matter? Might seem a strange question. Because we asked the children in our study, when do they do these behaviours? We knew exactly when they did these behaviours. We can plot when these behaviours are most likely to occur throughout the day. So if you take a typical school day here, so there's a gap after they get to school, and then we measured them after school, because we were interested in their free time decision-making for sedentary behaviour or active behaviour. You can see that the black line shows the dominance of television viewing in the after-school period. So at about 6 in the evening, 25% of all behaviours recorded reflected television viewing. And then that peaked to about 45% around about 9 o'clock at night. So to put it simply, 45% of kids were watching TV at 9 o'clock at night. And no other behaviour gets anywhere close to that. So physical activity in the red peaks at about 15% at 6 to 7 in the evening, when they could be out playing, depending on the time of year. They could be at sports clubs, and so on and so forth. Now, you can see a big gap between TV and sport and physical activity. Now, my question is, the big peak of TV viewing at the end of the day may actually not be as problematic as we think. I don't know what you're like, but I'm unlikely to be that physically active at 9 o'clock at night. And my physical activity will come earlier in the day, walking to work, purposeful exercise during or after work, playing golf in daylight hours. You know, I try to keep it down to about 5 hours a day. Good, I'm glad somebody's still awake. I wouldn't be playing golf or being that physically active at 9 o'clock at night, nor would my 2 teenage boys. So it's unlikely to clash with physical activity. On the other hand, this is data for weekend girls. I've just highlighted here in the red is TV viewing, in the purple is physical activity. Now, during those times, it's potentially a clash. So during daylight hours, during certain times of the day, TV viewing may inhibit physical activity. And we looked at this in our data set. So we looked at the 3-hour, what we call critical hours period after school during the week. And you can see the technological sedentary behaviour in the middle here. So that's basically screen time. 50 minutes of the 3 hours could be clearly identified as screen time for boys. And there are other sedentary behaviours in here as well. Socialising, sedentary behaviours and so on. So during those 3-hour period, that 3-hour window after school, it probably is quite a critical period to be moving from sedentary behaviours to more active behaviours, but not necessarily later at night. Okay, so very quickly to try to make sure I stick to time. My third and final question is, can we actually reduce screen time? Recently we've conducted a small systematic review of interventions of young people, that's anybody below the age of 19, and these are the types of studies that are coming up in the literature. The so-called clinic-based interventions, these are usually related to children with obesity. 3 of the 4 studies showed significant reductions in sedentary behaviour, not necessarily just screen time, but sedentary behaviour generally. But all of the studies are with relatively young children, what we would call pre-adolescent, pre-teenage children. And they were successful at reducing sedentary behaviour of what were essentially overweight children in the young age group. If you look at more population or community-based interventions, this is typically in the home or the school setting, 6 out of 9 studies showed significant reductions in intervention effectiveness. Again, they tended to be children rather than adolescents. And home-based interventions incorporating the family seem to have the strongest effects, and that's maybe something we need to look at more in the future. And then thirdly, lab-based studies all show quite large effects, and these would be very well controlled studies where they reinforce a reduction in sedentary behaviour or even punish the use of sedentary behaviour in a very controlled setting. They were all with overweight or obese children in that younger age group, so it's still quite restrictive. If you look at a recent review that was published on interventions to reduce sedentary behaviours in children, there were 7 studies reviewed. This is a reduction in BMI, and you can see that there are all showing reductions, but interestingly only 2 were statistically significant, although I would suggest actually that for at least 4 of those studies a reduction of at least 1 in BMI is probably clinically meaningful. But the authors of this study concluded that interventions are associated with improvement in weight parameters, but this is modest in magnitude and is difficult to interpret. The results seem to be a little bit up and down. So the evidence is not quite as clear. Now, one reason might be that a lot of these studies, particularly the laboratory studies, target certain sedentary behaviours. So they might target a reduction in screen time. What happens is that time gets diverted into 2 activities. One is physical activity, which is what we wanted, but the other one is into other sedentary behaviours that we weren't targeting. So instead of doing more screen time, you reduce your screen time, you do some physical activity, but you also do another sedentary behaviour like sit and talk more, sit and play a sedentary game or something like that. That's why I think the area is not quite as clear as we sometimes think. So to conclude, does sedentary behaviour actually matter? The answer is definitely yes, in my opinion, but the situation is actually quite a complex one. It's a behaviour that is largely independent of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and this point is being made quite a lot in the literature at the moment, both for children, adolescents and adults. But it may have independent health effects, something I've not had time to review today, for example on weight, but also some very interesting data now on metabolic markers, where regardless of how active you are, the amount of sedentary time that you spend is a predictor of adverse metabolic profile. So it's probably wise to restrict screen-based and other sedentary behaviours. And I think if you want a practical solution, we should say to children to restrict it during daylight hours, because daylight hours would be the time when we might expect them to have most opportunity to be physically active. But of course, in saying that, we don't want to do anything to restrict physical activity. We want to be encouraging that regardless. So in conclusion, I'd love you to go out and buy my new book, which of course expands more on these issues with my fellow co-editor and co-authors. But with that commercial aside, I will conclude and be very welcome to take some questions. Thank you very much for your attention.